A few weeks ago, I made a video about how Europe would look like if instead of having its current political borders, it became divided by language. Europe has a lot of languages, and in that scenario, we would see some countries come together while others would break apart. You guys liked that video, so I decided to do the same for South America. The languages of South America can be divided into three groups: the languages of the former colonial powers, the indigenous languages, and various pockets of other languages spoken by immigrant populations. We'll get to those native ones in a minute, but other than those, South America has 5 main official languages. One is Spanish, the most spoken throughout all of the continent. The other is Portuguese, spoken in Brazil, which geographically takes up about half of the land as well. And the other 3 are English, Dutch, and French, the official languages of Guyana, Suriname, and the French Guiana territory. These aren't spoken anywhere else, so the divisions in the case of these would remain the same. And essentially we would have a 1 versus 1. All of the Spanish-speaking countries versus the 1 Portuguese-speaking country. The reach of the 2 languages in both territory and population is surprisingly almost equal, despite Spanish being divided by various countries. But we'll get to that in a second. The origins of these language divisions lie in the manner in which South America was colonized, divided between the Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires, and where the British, Dutch, and French also had exclaves. But because of this colonial reality, paralleled with the native one, most Southern American countries today speak more than only their colonizers' language. In fact, there are at least 18 languages in South America that are spoken by more than 100,000 people. The most spoken is Spanish at 214 million, but followed very closely by Portuguese at 211 million. Then comes in the first native language, Quechua, spoken by 7.7 million people, mostly in Bolivia and Peru. Then English, Guarani, and several other native ones. And other external languages also have large number of speakers due to immigrant communities. German is spoken by 1.2 million, as is Italian. And Japanese is spoken by 425,000, more than French, which is the official language of one of the regions, only spoken by 319,000. Dutch, for instance, is the lowest on this list at 126,000, behind Hindustani even. So before we get into that Spanish versus Portuguese 1 versus 1, let's take a closer look at the reality of the native languages. Despite the fact that all countries have as their mainly spoken language one of the 5 European ones, many of them also have more than 1 official language, paralleling Spanish or Portuguese with 1 or more native languages. Bolivia, for instance, the country with the largest indigenous population of South America, 62%, has 36 official languages. But the main one is Spanish, even though a lot of people also speak Quechua or other native idioms. If we were to focus on all of these native languages and redesign the continent's political borders based on those, or even based on all of the local dialects that exist, we'd see a full-on balkanization of the continent with tons of independent regions. For instance, in this map, we can see the main native languages stretching to all of Latin America. Quechua in blue is the most common throughout, followed by Guarani in yellow and Aymara in orange. Up in Mexico, there's a lot of Nahuatl speaking regions and mostly Mayan languages too. And then back in South America itself, a region of Chile and Argentina also speak a lot of Mapudungun. Sorry for mispronouncing this. But if we set those main ones apart and gather all small dialects into language families, look at the patchwork of a map that we have, with at least 9 large language groups that don't even have continuous use throughout the territory, but mainly exist scattered around. And in total, there are about 600 indigenous languages throughout South America, grouped into around 40 families. It's insane. It's one of the most linguistically diverse places in the world. However, in contrast, the number of native speakers has been declining more and more, and it's predicted that if the trend continues, it will become the exact opposite, one of the least linguistically diverse regions in the world, because pretty much everyone will either be speaking Spanish or Portuguese. Before we keep going with the video, a quick message from today's sponsor, Klima. It's not often that a sponsor is both a good product, helps the channel, and is also good for the world. Klima is working towards helping to solve the issue of climate change, and this is how they do it. You go on their app and calculate your carbon footprint in only a couple of minutes. Then you're presented with a number of climate projects that capture or reduce the same amount of carbon you spend. You then have the opportunity to help fund those projects all across the world and through them offset your carbon footprint. In addition, they also explain what easy changes you can make to your lifestyle in order to reduce your share of emissions, and this way you could even become carbon positive, reducing more emissions than you create. If we all did this, the climate change issue we all face would be much smaller. Download the app from the App Store or Play Store and go carbon neutral in 3 minutes. I partnered with them for this video, so if you go to the link in the description and use the code KNOWLEDGE10, you will have an additional 10 trees planted in your name. So join me and go carbon neutral mutual with klima so we can make our planet a greener place together. Now, back to the video. South America also has an interesting aspect to it when it comes to language today. Due to many isolated tribes, it has a lot of language isolates, which are languages that are completely unrelated to any other, or that at least cannot be grouped up into any language group. Basque and Korean are other examples throughout the world, but these are not very common, save here in South America. If every region with its own language became independent, we'd have a lot of these small city-states, or rather village-states in some cases. And we're not even getting into the variants of Spanish that also exist depending on the country and or region. Colombian Spanish isn't exactly the same as Argentinian Spanish, and even inside Argentina, its Spanish varies with regional dialects, as we can see on this map. The main argument as to why this happens has precisely to do with the influence of native languages, which, as we saw, vary from region to region, and they would influence the locals' way of speaking Spanish. For example, in Bolivia, there are 4 main Spanish regional dialects currently spoken, each showing different influences from the native tongues. The same happens with some manners of speaking and some terms that are used in Brazilian Portuguese, depending on which state you're in. Although I'm uncertain if native influence is also the reason in this case, or if it has to do with migration waves from Europe. If you're from Brazil and know the reason why states have different accents, please let me know in the comments. So let's summarize. Each Southern American country speaks one European orange language, plus a lot of native ones, plus those of immigrant communities. In every one of them, the European origin one has become dominant and is spoken by the majority of the population inside that country, even if many of them parallelly speak native ones as well. Out of the 12 countries in the continent, 1 mainly speaks Portuguese, 8 mainly speak Spanish, 1 Dutch, 1 French, and 1 English. The Guianas have these 3 as official languages, but in reality the population mostly speaks variations of Creole based on each of those 3. If you don't know what a Creole is, it's basically a type of language that combines a European language with locally used ones, mainly from African origin. In the case of the Guianas, this had to do with the slaves that European powers brought over from Africa, creating these sort of new mixed languages. So assuming each Guiana would remain as it is, because each has its own language / Creole already. Understanding Brazil would see no change because all of it speaks Brazilian Portuguese, and assuming that we wouldn't base this on native languages due to the non-dominance of them, plus the fact that there are a lot of them and separation based on it would lead to a ridiculous balkanization of the territory, then we would effectively only have one new scenario if South America was divided by language. All Spanish-speaking countries would unite. South America would go from having 12 countries to only 5. Brazil, the 3 Guianas, and a mega country consisting of the remaining 8. And how would this country look like? It would unite the territory of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, having a size of around 8.9 million square kilometers, just surpassing Brazil, which has 8.5 million, and accounting for about half of the continent, which totals at around 17.8. It would therefore become the 5th largest country in the world, surpassing precisely Brazil and only being behind Russia, Canada, China, and the United States, and ahead of nations like Australia or India. When it comes to how rich it would be, we need to add up the GDPs of each of them. This would total at around 3.3 trillion US dollars, taking into account the IMF estimates for 2021. They would literally almost equal the projected 2021 GDP for Brazil, ranking 8th in the largest economies in the world, 9th if you count the EU, and also take into account these values are GDP PPP, meaning the GDP is measured at purchasing power parity, taking into account that reality for each country. This new country would surpass the GDP of France, the United Kingdom, and South Korea, only being surpassed by the very largest economies in the world and becoming one of the top 10 richest countries worldwide. It would, for instance, become a part of the G20. Population-wise, their number would roughly equal to those that already speak Spanish now, 211 million people. Again, pretty much the same as Brazil, becoming the world's 6th most populous country at this moment, only behind Pakistan, Indonesia, the United States, India, and China. It's really surprising how the Spanish-speaking part of Southern America, when put together, matches Brazil in almost every single topic. Territory size, population number, GDP. It's almost like the Portuguese and Spanish created a perfect divide of the territory when they were colonizing it. Although obviously this only relates to size, the population and GDP are values that grew and exist due to a lot of circumstances that take place after independence. These people would also be united in its religion, as the majority of the population in all of them is Roman Catholic. They would have to choose a new capital as their main city, even if they organized as a federal state and kept each country as its own state, having getting some degree of autonomy. And also a new flag would have to be created to accurately represent their common Spanish language, but also their common heritage and history, never forgetting the important impact and representation of native populations, which, as we saw in the beginning in one of those maps, are distributed along and throughout the existing borders, which demonstrates, along with the common Spanish speaking, that language is in fact not a defining factor when drawing borders, and other cultural or political differences are in fact what is taken into account. What might happen sometimes is that language is an example of those cultural changes. So, that is what South America would look like if its political borders were replaced and we instead divided the continent by its main languages. There would essentially only be one change, which would be the union of the 8 Spanish-speaking countries, effectively creating a situation of one large-speaking Spanish country versus another already existing large Portuguese-speaking country, allowing us to project how this new country would look like, how it would compare to Brazil, and how it would compare to other ones worldwide, effectively creating a new world power. Also allowing us to understand the multitude of languages that exist in South America when we take into account regional dialects and most of all native languages, which are so significant in this part of the world that despite centuries of colonization by Europeans, they remain incredibly relevant up to today, being parallelly spoken along the main Spanish or Portuguese and even influencing it and being used by hundreds of thousands of people every day. If we were to take all of those into account as the main factor for country separation, then the redrawing of political borders would be much different, and we would not only see a union of Spanish-speaking countries in the west coast of the continent, but also a multitude of small and scattered independent regions. Thanks so much for watching this video. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge.